Good day, everybody. Good day, Angus. How are you doing? It is the 16th of October, 10 a.m. On the Eastern Daylight Time, and today we have a special treat. Angus von Schoenberg, Industry Officer of TrueNoord, will be joining us, and I had a sneak peek of his presentation. And most of you who know me and my past, I have always been a proponent of the regional sector, the regional market sector, having transacted aircraft into space over the last few years, continue to do so, and also on the appraisal side. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Bryson Monteleone. I'm a current board member of the ISTAT board, principal and founder of BPM Aero and Bravo Delta, and also a current chair of the ISTAT Content Committee, which means you'll probably see me a lot more going forward on with regards to learning labs and any of our kind of external communication content. And that being said, we're always looking for new content when it comes to learning labs and chats, anything else that we could really involve the ISTAT membership. So please reach out to me if you'd like, if interested. Also, we also will be looking at the ISTAT Aero Talks coming up, which is our version of TED Talks coming up for ISTAT America's conference in 2026, and always looking for great ways to ensure that the ISTAT membership is promoting and kind of working through things they might be working on. And this year, we're going to be looking for great trading stories of Angus, which I'm sure you have many. So before we begin, we will be taking Q&A. There is a Q&A function, of course, on the Zoom here. Those of us, obviously, no stranger to Zoom these days, given how many years we've been on this. I will do my best to, I'll be monitoring questions. I will do my best to ensure that the questions are asked in a time way and are pertinent to the section that Angus is covering. Otherwise, we will do this. We'll do Q&A at the end of the session. We've got about 75 minutes, Angus, to go through all your great slides, which I got to preview again when I was on the flight home yesterday. And I'm looking forward to what, the content and also what TrueNoord is working on. So without further much ado, Angus von Schoenberg, Industry Officer of TrueNoord. Angus, you and I have crossed paths many times, I think, in addition to recently and also last year in Portugal. Angus deploys extensive experience in the regional aircraft market with disposition, investment, and managing the expansion of the fleet of aircraft with appropriate leasing solutions. Each year, Angus also publishes his own industry report covering TrueNoord's fleet specializations. This year, the 2025 edition was the 70-seater. Next year, the turboprop. So looking forward to seeing that.
Correct, yeah.
Yep. And so, Angus, I think I've covered all my things. Again, your deck will be available to everybody who signs into this and also on the ISTAT website. And I will let you take over. I'm looking at this picture of Sydney, and it kind of reminds me that those of us in the northern hemisphere are hitting winter, and Sydney is just starting a nice summertime. So it kind of makes me now long with the fact that warmer weather is leaving us and here and getting better down south. So Angus, please take it away. You've got a lot to cover today.
Okay, thank you very much, Bryson. Before we start, the notice on your screen is nothing other than a customary disclaimer language covering the information in the contents of this presentation. I don't intend to dwell on it. It's far too boring to read the whole thing through, but would advise you to read it once the slides are distributed afterwards. Okay, just beginning with a sort of bit of background on TrueNoord itself, if I can get the slider to move on. We were formed in 2016, are a lessor of regional aircraft based in Amsterdam. We've also got offices in Dublin and Singapore, and some of our team are also based in the UK. Our aircraft comprises a mixture of turboprops, regional jets, and small narrow bodies, sometimes also referred to as crossover jets, ranging from the ATR 42 up to the largest aircraft in our portfolio, which is currently the E195 E2. These are mainly placed with a variety of well-known airlines around the world. We currently have just over 100 aircraft, and as some of you may have seen earlier on in the week, we've also recently placed our first forward order for a number of 20 E195, E2s directly with the manufacturer. Now, as I said, we currently focus on aircraft with a capacity of 50 to 150 seats. The reason I say currently is quite important in the sense that we will never compete in the larger narrow body or wide body space, but new technology aircraft could well in time lead us to acquiring aircraft below 50 seats. We don't see that happening any time in the next few years. Now, I was asked to say a bit about new technology aircraft, but that's a big subject upon which we could easily fill another learning lab. But I will make a few points on this a bit later on. So unless there's any questions on that, if we could maybe move on to regional aircraft themselves. Oh yes, just this one here, just to show you our current customer base, which is pretty well diversified around the world, with many well-known names in Europe, North America, and Asia. But we've also got significant exposure in Africa, but a little less in Latin America. So what's the difference between regional aircraft and other classes? Permit me perhaps to be a little controversial to start with, in the sense that there is a school of thought that says narrow bodies are mostly regional aircraft, as a large proportion operate short regional and domestic routes. If you think of one of the busiest routes in the world, which I believe is Seoul to Jeju in South Korea, or even others, New York to Boston or Washington, or in Europe, Dublin to London Heathrow, these are all short flights of an hour or thereabouts. So, many people would argue, well, surely those are regional flights. Obviously, there are many flights that are much longer. It's not regional if it's transcontinental US, or if you're Turkish Airlines, who, for example, operate a lot of quite long flights on narrow body aircraft. But probably the majority of flights on narrow body aircraft are less than a couple of hours. You could also look at it in another way, which is that some also consider that aircraft manufactured by anybody other than Airbus or Boeing are regional aircraft. That's perhaps not a bad way of describing it, assuming that you consider an A220 to be a narrow body. But as I said, at TrueNoord, we think of aircraft in the 50 to 150 seat category, from current new generation TPs up to the A220 and the E2. But we shouldn't forget that there's an awful lot of other regional aircraft types, most of which are now out of production. They range from aircraft as small as 9-seater Cessna Caravans, 19-seater Twin Otters, Saab 340s, older Dash 8s, Fokker aircraft in the past, British Aerospace aircraft in the past, and indeed Bombardier aircraft of old, the CRJ 200 and 700, for example. These are aircraft that are all out of production, and Bombardier is no longer in the regional aircraft segment. So interestingly here that perhaps, unlike the larger sector, it took a lot longer for the regional aircraft segment to consolidate down into a small number of OEMs in the similar way that the larger aircraft manufacturers have done so. However, in the regional space, it's not impossible that the OEM duopolies might go full throttle into reverse at some point in the future, and that's because of new technology. The aircraft shown here are just a selection of what's out there. Couldn't possibly put in everything, because there are a multitude of different projects. But the feature here is that each of them comes from a new startup OEM rather than an established incumbent. And that may, as I say, have the effect of recreating the multitude of OEMs that used to exist in this segment. So although not a major focus for today, all new tech projects shown here are in the regional aircraft space. The reason why this is the case is that for electric propulsion, the low energy density of batteries compared to Jet A1 is such that for anything larger than a small one, the aircraft would simply be too heavy to take off. Furthermore, a conventional aircraft is built to take off heavy and land much lighter as fuel is burnt off. A battery aircraft would land at the same weight as takeoff, which would necessitate a larger and heavier landing gear, making the whole aircraft even heavier. For hydrogen-powered aircraft, energy density of a kilogram or a pound of fuel is good, but the fuel, even in liquid form, is much lighter, so that each kilo of hydrogen takes up more volume. This means that fuel tanks would have to be much larger and at least partially stored within the airframe. There are other projects, of course, including with existing OEMs, who are also developing new technology variants of existing aircraft. The ATR Evo is an example of that. From a TrueNoord point of view, we are actively exploring this segment and have created an internal team, which we kind of call a hub, to work on new technology projects with a view to establishing how such aircraft can be integrated into our fleet as and when they become available. A major difference to mainline aircraft is the average sector length on which regional aircraft are flown. You can see here from in the distance below 250 kilometers, almost half of those flights in the world are flown by turboprops. And as soon as you go up the scale towards 500 kilometers or thereabouts, we see that still half of the world's flights are performed by regional aircraft, whether that's turboprops or regional jets. And of course, as soon as you get to longer sectors, the narrow bodies and the larger aircraft start to take over. There's also a common misconception that regional aircraft are flown by small, independent regional airlines whose financial strength is often considered to be somewhat weak. Sure, most LCCs and major long-haul only airlines don't use them, but most are flown either by major airlines, their regional subsidiaries, or airlines that provide capacity to major carriers. Even some low-cost carriers deploy fleets of regional aircraft. For example, I'm thinking here of Lion Air's subsidiary Wings Air, or Azul in Brazil, or JetBlue, but we'll talk a bit more about that later on. An important characteristic of the regional aircraft world is aircraft performance. The possible restrictions shown here can often inhibit larger aircraft from operating. Short runways and obstacles close to airports are the most common of these, but hot and high locations or noise can in some cases be relevant. Before we see some examples of restricted airports, which I'll show you in a minute, there's now over 4,000 commercial airports in the world, according to this chart, which I've reproduced from ATR. 42% of those, or the better part of 2,000 airports, rely on regional aircraft only. Now, I guess you shouldn't understand this as meaning that they're only served by regionals because of performance-related restrictions, as some of these airports simply just don't justify larger aircraft from a passenger volume perspective. But many are restricted, and that's why performance is important. So I just want to show you a few examples of restricted airports around the world. One of the most commonly cited examples of such an airport is London City, and many of these restrictions apply here. London City doesn't just have a short runway, it's also got several obstacles in the way, the most well-known of which is the Canary Wharf Tower, which you can see in the back of the image here. And that represents a significant obstacle. But also noise is also a concern at London City. If we cross the Atlantic, Aspen in Colorado is often described as America's most extreme airport. And the largest commercial airliner that can operate into there currently, I believe, is an E175. Now, that's not because of the runway length. I believe it's a highway at one end of the runway. In Europe, there is many so-called short takeoff and landing airports or stall ports, and these are particularly common in Norway, for example, where there are approximately 50 or so airports with short runways or in some cases obstacles. And the biggest aircraft that can operate into those is the Dash 8 100 or 200. But we shouldn't forget that there's others. Toronto Billy Bishop's an interesting one because although the runway has been extended, the airport is still restricted to turboprops only, and that's mainly the Dash 8 400 because of noise restrictions. The final one here is an example of hot and high locations. La Paz in Bolivia has the distinction of being the highest airport in the world that operates international flights. There are a few higher airports around in China, but they operate domestic flights only. So the largest aircraft that can currently be operated into La Paz is something like an A319 without any payload restrictions. There are some larger aircraft that do go in there, but they are payload restricted, particularly on a hot day. Another common misconception is that aircraft of a similar size are head-to-head competitors in the same way as Boeing or Airbus narrowbodies. But in the regional world, that isn't always the case. The difference between similar turboprops illustrates this probably better than anything else. If you compare an ATR 72 with a Dash 8, the Dash 8 has clearly superior performance characteristics, and it can fly faster, can climb faster. That's important for some of our customers as well, including people like Widerøe or Ethiopian in Africa, where there's a lot of high and hot airports. The Dash 8 also has a forward door, which enables access, which is all important for the US market, where they like to use an air bridge. In theory, an ATR can now also offer this, but to the best of my knowledge, nobody's ordered this variant yet. However, the downside of the Dash 8 is that the operating costs are substantially higher than the ATR 72s, particularly in respect of the fact that it has a much larger engine. But it's still less than the similar sized regional jets. But we'll talk a bit more about that later on.
Yeah, I was gonna ask Angus, given where the order book for the Dash 8 is no longer in production, or maybe might come back, I guess rumors, and then the ATR is now a winner in the large turboprop space. This chart is very telling about performance, but you highlighted the fact that the Dash 8, given the bigger engine on the PW150, seemed to be too much at that time for turboprop operators. Do you think the turboprop segment, and maybe we'll talk about this later, but we've come a long way given and you mentioned the new technologies coming forward, which are all seem to be, if you look at the pictures minus a couple too, are all turboprop adjacent. That, especially here in the US, turboprops, there's been a reticence to fly turboprops. Do you think that we've combated that hurdle now, and that people are more accepting of the turboprop space?
Well, people accepting of the turboprop space, I think that's a slow process. We're beginning to see a little bit of evidence of that. Particularly in those markets that are historically a bit hostile to turboprops. It's not just the US that has this hostility. Typically we haven't seen that in Europe, where turboprops are very common. But there's also been some parts of the developing world historically that haven't particularly liked turboprops. Turkey being an example of that. But we see that as slowly beginning to evolve and change. And maybe part of that is driven by increased awareness of sustainability issues, for example, where people are beginning to realize that turboprops are really quite efficient.
Yep. No, I agree. It's the evolution has been exponential to say kind of where things were and where things are going now, and I think the future looks pretty bright given the business case for the turboprop sector. So I think your next session is going to go into more development and kind of where or at least deployment, sorry, of the regional aircraft. So yeah, back to you, my friend.
Okay, thank you, Bryson. Okay, right. So what I want to talk here a little bit is how regional aircraft are deployed, because it is significantly different from the larger aircraft. I think the first thing to say here is that the US is the largest regional aircraft market in the world. Over 80% of all 70-seat category regional jets operate in North America, the largest of which are Republic and SkyWest, and these are the examples shown on the maps here. But just, a small note here is the Republic map is a little bit out of date in the sense that it is pre its merger with Mesa, so that'll add something to it going forward. In terms of their role, it is primarily to feed the hubs of US majors from secondary cities. And these are almost exclusively domestic routes within the US, with a few exceptions. Now, as you can see here, Republic flies for all three majors, as does SkyWest, which also then adds Alaska or Horizon. Now, increasingly, regional airlines in Europe are also replicating the hub feed model. For example, a large proportion of the Air France hub services now feed Paris, whereas previously the focus had often been providing transversal connectivity either within France between major cities there or to other major cities outside France in neighbouring countries. Similarly, Lufthansa City now predominantly feeds Munich and Frankfurt. But we shouldn't ignore the turboprops in this hub feeding role. They can also be used for this purpose. Within our customer base, we have a couple of examples here. Philippine Airlines PAL Express primarily uses its Dash 8-400s to feed its operations out of Manila and a little bit out of Cebu as well. An interesting example in Europe is Aer Lingus's operation into Dublin. For many United Kingdom regional cities outside the London area, Dublin has become the most convenient way of connecting onwards to the US, not least because you clear US immigration there and arrive in the US in the same way as a domestic passenger. Now, that said, Aer Lingus also has a separate base, which isn't shown on the map here, in Belfast to serve UK regional airports, but this doesn't perform a hub feed role. Another application often touted by Embraer, for example, is this concept of right sizing. And this can be demonstrated within a couple of examples here. One of Europe's most competitive routes is Amsterdam to Dublin, with 3 carriers competing. And in this case, KLM adopts a strategy of varying the size of its aircraft to match demand, much more than either Aer Lingus or Ryanair, which operate narrow bodies only, and particularly in the case of Ryanair, it's one size of aircraft only. What this does is it helps to maintain an above average yield as well as enabling more frequencies. By way of an aside, right sizing was also extensively used during COVID when connectivity began to be restored, because in many cases, regional aircraft were deployed to operate services normally done with larger aircraft when demand was still quite low. In that sense, regional aircraft can be a very effective tool for airlines to manage the impact of any demand downturns. It's not the first time that's happened. Similar things happened in the 2008 financial crisis. Anyway, this, in both cases, this helped regional aviation to recover more quickly from the pandemic, for example. Now, there's another, a little less common role for regional aircraft, and we've already alluded to it in the performance section, and that's the provision of essential services, which are often government subsidized, and that's also an important application of regional aircraft, mainly turboprops, it has to be said. In Europe, for example, there's 165 so-called public service obligation routes, ranging from 51 in Norway down to a single route in Ireland. The example here shown is Greece, where there's 28 such routes. Across the water in the US, there's about 140 odd such essential air service routes and 44 or so in Alaska. But interestingly, the biggest essential air service program in the world now is actually in India, where there is over 400 routes operated under the so-called UDAN regional connectivity scheme. Now, there's a couple of other smaller ones. For example, there's a similar program, or at a much smaller scale, with smaller aircraft that also operates in Indonesia. Now, finally, both turboprops and regional jets also operate extensively on special mission applications. This includes, so-called fly-in, fly-out operations to transport workers to mining sites, mostly in the middle of absolutely nowhere in places that most of you will have never heard of. This is most well known in places like Australia, serving an extensive collection of mines inland. But it's not just limited to Australia. There's a lot of this that goes on, in neighbouring Papua New Guinea, for example, and elsewhere in the world, for example, in Chile or even parts of Africa. Now, beyond that, there's also a number of different niche applications. A common one that we've heard about recently in the last few years is firefighting, given the number of forest fires that have existed around the world. And to date, a lot of the sort of older 146s or RJ85s have been converted for firefighting purposes. And it's an ideal platform to do that with, in the sense it's got 4 engines and a high wing. So it lends itself very well to fitting a retardant tank in the fuselage and spraying out water retardant. But there's also other niche applications in terms of things like aerial surveillance.
I think before we go to the next section, we got a couple questions, and I would
Yeah.
say, first of all, the essential air service map is near and dear to my heart, because I think, if you remember, our one of our founding fathers, Mort Beyer, would write about essential air services till the cows came home. So that kind of brought back a nice memory. What I find is interesting on a couple, the initial regional jet map, was that I think you probably remember way back when Bombardier introduced the CRJ 100 200, the whole notice of hub bypass. That was what the regional jets were going to be accomplishing. And I think now what's interesting is that we're feeding the hubs again, but now we have longer range aircraft. So the CRJ 200 can only go 1,000 or so miles until really it becomes uncomfortable for people, but also it runs out of fuel. And now we have the E-jets, the long range aircraft, that are actually doing, in some cases, almost transcon missions, almost the same range as what the 73300 400 generation did. But I find it very interesting. I was going to do any thoughts on the hub bypass, or you want me to just add? We have some good questions here, so we can just go into those. But I just thought the Bombardier sales team would be rolling over, thinking, "Oh wait, we went so far on hub bypass, and now we're actually going to hub feed."
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fact here, and we'll cover this a little bit later on, because I think when the CRJs and the E145s first came into service, that was at a time when fuel was relatively cheap. So these hub bypass routes could be operated fairly
Yep.
economically. But now we're in a situation where not only fuel but other operating costs, things like maintenance, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on,
Yeah, no,
have become
absolutely.
so
So
expensive that it's not particularly economical to operate those aircraft on those kind of hub bypass connections as was perhaps once the case. However, you do raise an interesting point, and that, this comes back to the new technology point that we talked about earlier. There are a number of carriers, also in the US, looking at new technology, although this isn't coming anytime soon in the next few years, but possibly within the next decade, to use that type of technology to perhaps reopen some of those point-to-point routes that
right.
are no longer served, or even to connect some of the much smaller routes that had been lost even prior to the introduction of those smaller 50-seat regional jets.
Yeah, no, I think that that is where that new technology start to can really plant a flag on providing that connectivity outside of what we consider the system. I have a question, and we can save it to the end if you want to, but it's about scope clauses. I know regulatory stuff wasn't going to be in your purview, but I think it is a little bit applicable to the kind of RJ side and the thoughts of scope clauses. Any thoughts on that right now, on the U.S. scope clause side?
Well, yeah, scope clause is clearly an artificial restriction. Um, and some people always say, well, if the scope clause didn't exist, then there wouldn't be a significant market for the let's say relatively booming 75, 76 seat aircraft market that actually exists out there today. But at the same time, you have to say, there's an awful lot of routes that wouldn't justify a larger aircraft. So yes, it might have been a smaller aircraft, a smaller market without scope clauses, but it would still be there. And some of those routes that are currently restricted to by scope would inevitably be operated by larger aircraft. But
Yeah.
in terms of scope, we really don't think that scope is going to change anytime soon. The US the US majors are doing pretty well. The unions, which are pretty powerful in that market, there's absolutely no incentive for anybody to change scope at the moment. So we think it's will stay as is for quite some time.
Yep. No, I think that tracks very well. All right, we got a couple of questions, but I think they're going to be great for the end. So carry on, my friend.
Okay. Okay. I think the next logical thing to cover a little bit is, the size of this industry compared to other parts. So if you look at scale, there's some 7,500 regional aircraft above 30 seats from the OEMs shown, and that represents about 21% of the global commercial airliner fleet. Of course, needless to say, that is by numbers of aircraft and obviously not by dollar value. Of the types relevant to TrueNoord, the fleet has grown by about 500 units over the last 5 years to what's now a fleet of over 4,000 aircraft. However, a good chunk of the listed types are now out of production. As a consequence, those types are in gradual decline. Now, Bryson, you made a remark about the Dash 8 400 earlier on. You will notice that the Dash 8 400 is shown as out of production, but marked in orange. This is because it's quite likely that de Havilland may relaunch production of either the 400 variant or the smaller 300 variant, or possibly both, at its new facility in Calgary over the years to come. But as much earlier, we shouldn't forget that there's also a lot of other regional aircraft types out there. There's 2,500 other smaller types, and the size of this fleet continues to decline, with over 1,000 retirements over the last 15 years. We were already talking about the 50-seat regional jets, and that is indeed the segment now that it seems to be going into retirement at the fastest rate. But at a more broader rate, a lot of these older generation aircraft are being increasingly retired, with the exception of the Twin Otter and the stability in the Cessna Caravan fleet. Just a few words, though, on orders. In terms of the OEM share, both jet OEMs in the space have an equal share, roughly speaking, but the larger crossover jet segment accounts for over 65% of the backlog. And in that particular area, the Airbus A220 is at least currently in the lead, by quite some margin. Another interesting feature of the regional fleet is the average age of in-production aircraft, which actually is relatively young at about 6 or 7 years. And looking specifically, at one of the big fleets therein, which is, the E190, 195 fleet, these aircraft are now out of production. But the fleet is still below 15 years of average age. Bear in mind the E1 generation, although it's been superseded by the E2, remains a pretty up-to-date, modern 21st century fly-by-wire aircraft that was only introduced into service originally in 2005. Now, looking at the fleet distribution by geography, as we've already said, North America is the largest market in the world for commercial aircraft. And that's even more true for regional aircraft, as it accounts for about 1/3 of the world's regional aircraft. That fleet comprises over 1,500 regional jets and 220 or so turboprops. Now, very few of those turboprops are currently in the US. Most of them are in Canada. But looking, at the turboprop market, that market is increasingly dominated by Asian operators. And interestingly, it is there among the so-called low-cost carriers. For example, Lion Air subsidiary Wings Air is now the biggest ATR operator in the world. And Indigo in India also has a big ATR 72 fleet. Now, the US is also home to most of the world's largest regional aircraft operators. There's 2 mega regionals. We've already seen the map of the routes for SkyWest and Republic. And again, this is pre-merger. If you merge the Mesa fleet with Republic, you'd then see 2 carriers in the US with over 300 regional aircraft each, which is, would be pretty substantial. Then there's, a couple more in the US with over 100 aircraft. But then, apart from Porter, Air France, Hop, and Wings Air, all the biggest operators are in North America.
So Angus, you brought up some interesting thoughts on the aircraft out of production, in production. I was reminded of, and this goes back, but I think, and then somebody else asked a question, but I was going to say, you missed out on the Saab 2000, which maybe by design or by circumstance, but I think was the Saab 2000 ahead of its time, and then somebody also piped in on the question whether, what about the Dornier 228 and 328? We look at those platforms. Any thoughts on kind of whether these programs were ahead of their time, or maybe didn't, or missed the mark, or kind of where the evolution of some of these regional jets that we no longer have in production and barely in service?
Yeah, fair question. I mean, I guess it's back in the slides earlier, the things would have become too busy had I put everybody in there.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, so
yeah.
it's kind of it's kind of it's selected in order, for the audience to see. But yes, the Saab 2000 definitely was probably ahead of its time. It was a fast turboprop at the time, but didn't really catch on. The number of aircraft built was really quite small. And at the time, you could also say, to some degree, the same thing about the 328 turboprop, and indeed, to a lesser extent, the 328 jet.
Yeah,
Now, the 328 jet evolved in a slightly different way. It found, the biggest part of its market in kind of special missions operations of various shapes and sizes in surveillance. For example, the US military is a big operator of 328s.
yep,
But we shouldn't forget also that Deutsche Aircraft, as it is today, is relaunching the 328 in the form of the 328 Eco.
yep.
And that's something that we're looking at, quite closely, and could be an interesting product for certain markets.
No, I agree, and we've been following those, kind of the news clips as they come out. Noticing the average age of the E-jet family is getting up there. I assume that's both an opportunity and a threat at the same time. What are your thoughts on the E1, the E175 E1? How long it'll stay in production, and does that kind of go anything kind of? Does your order include some of those on the E2 side? There's a lot of questions coming in around E175, E1, E2. Obviously, this goes back to scope clauses again, but
Well,
maybe I was
yeah,
trying to
yeah,
bundle
yeah.
these together a bit.
Yeah, partly it does. Just quickly in answer to our own position. Amongst our within the context of TrueNoord's forward order, there is a certain number of options on top of the 20 firm, and within those options, we do have the ability to swap some of those into E175 E1s. Now, the E175 E1, remains a popular aircraft. Will the E175 E2 ever be launched? Is a question. It becomes a very heavy aircraft, and isn't scope clause compliant from a weight perspective. And does it offer much benefit over the E1? I think a lot of the US carriers are thinking, well, even if it was possible to operate an E175 E2, yes, it will offer some fuel burn benefit, um, but not much beyond that, and it may be relatively small by the time you distribute that over the limited number of seats that are in that aircraft. So we certainly see the 175 as an aircraft that will continue to be popular, yeah, for quite some time, unless there's something possibly in the new technology world that could replace it. But we don't see that coming for, at least 10 years or so. The new tech stuff that's coming down the road, to the extent that it's any earlier, will be, at the smaller capacity end of that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and I think that kind of bodes well for the existing E1s. Do you see any programs or thoughts on kind of life extension on the E170 on the E1s, given the proclivity of the U.S. majors requiring those aircraft in perpetuity? Is there anything kind of looking forward to make sure that program stays? Because obviously we did have issues in so much as costs associated with the CF-34 engines. That was a cost. A lot of that was causing a little bit of shortened life, if you will, or lack of reinvestment. Any thoughts on kind of the elongation of that program, given the fact that these guys in North America need the aircraft, and there's no immediate real replacement?
Yeah, I mean the E170, well, the slightly smaller variant, is obviously now out of production, uh, and it's a bit smaller. We do see those gradually being retired, and actually replaced with E175s.
Yeah,
And those E175s, are still being ordered to this day, and form a not insignificant part of Embraer's order backlog. And yeah, the E175s will be around for some time to stay. Just in terms of the larger ones, though, the E190s in particular, we also think, that those will be around for some time, and we're seeing some examples, amongst our own customer base of that in Europe, where the likes of British Airways or Air France are committing large investment programs into their E1 fleets to upgrade, the cabin interiors. That's not a cheap modification.
Nope.
And to do that, you have to be thinking that you're going to be operating these aircraft for quite some years to come.
Well, and that's an interesting point because obviously the investments. I know Finnair did the same too with their E190s. Um, and do you see any with the new technologies coming along any ability for retrofit to some of these aircraft to help? We know that the regional space will be the prime target for any real. And you mentioned it before with these new technologies emerging, hybrid, electric, etc. Do we see any retrofit capabilities to help the current regional fleet? Are you seeing any of that or any thoughts around that?
Potentially, but I think that would apply to the turboprops and not the jets.
Okay.
In our view, there are we've already mentioned the ATR Evo, and in the new technology space, I forgot to mention Zero Avia, for example. Um, and they are focusing extensively on retrofitting existing turboprops, things like the Dash 8 or an ATR 72 with hydrogen fuel cell powered propulsion options. So that may come in future. But as I say, we see that mainly in the turboprop world and not in the jets.
Yep. Nope. Fair points. Okay. Carry on. I know you got some more slides going on.
Mhm. So I wanted to say a little bit about business models. Now, we've kind of mentioned this a little bit already. Um, Now, the most common models are those outlined in the slides you see in the left. Both the North American capacity purchase model and wholly owned subsidiaries account for some 80% of the world's regional aircraft. In both models, the regional subsidiary purely provides capacity to the major airline partner. The major airline or the parent entities assume all the bums on seat revenue risk and sell the seats. As long as the regionals operate the flights, they get paid essentially on a fixed fee per departure formula. Therefore, they're insulated from any short term demand related downturns. Even when a downturn does occur, it's often the case that the smaller capacity regional aircraft are then deployed on routes in place of larger narrow bodies. I think we mentioned that before. In both cases, the regionals benefit from lower operating costs, mainly in relation to crews, um, although this differential is much greater in North America than it is, for example, in Europe. Of the remaining 20% of the regional fleet, some provide capacity on an ACMI basis. These contracts tend to be a lot shorter than CPA agreements, and in some cases, these ACMI contracts, last for a matter of months rather than years. And the aircraft are not necessarily branded as the customer for which they operate. There are also a few airlines, mainly in Europe, that operate for mainline partners under franchise agreements. Air Nostrum, for example, has done this for Iberia under the Iberia regional brand for decades already. Emerald in Ireland, as we've already mentioned, the Aer Lingus operation, does this for Aer Lingus under a franchise agreement. There are also a number of airlines where regional aircraft or crossover jets are simply subfleets within a larger airline and don't operate as separate subsidiaries. The remaining carriers are independent and operating under their own brand, some of which are quite substantial in their own right, while others, such as Loganair, which is mentioned here, specialize in serving niche remote location markets. Typically, they do so on monopoly routes, which are often government supported in some way or other. We've already talked about the sort of the PSO type routes, and that's where a certain number of carriers like that operate.
So this is interesting because I know that my first question about this was, given the wide breadth of business models that are in this sector, which one do you think did the best under COVID, and kind of what happened during the pandemic?
Well, during the pandemic period, I think the main strength of regional airlines was to be able to operate essential services. Uh, when you looked at, if you think back to the pandemic years, and we were all looking at Flight Radar 24 or similar tools at the time to see, who was actually in the air. Um, and there was one point during COVID where Widerøe in Norway, because of its extensive essential air service route, was the busiest airline in Europe, operating more flights than anybody else. Okay, that's a bit of an extreme example. But I think the other aspect of is for those airlines that had regional subsidiaries, and were able to operate beginning to come out of the pandemic with smaller capacity aircraft. That was a great tool for them to use at the beginning of the time when people was being able to start flying again.
Yeah, no, and that's great anecdotal evidence of kind of where the evolution of, where the market started to reappear. We either had freighters of wide body aircraft trying to get stuff across the world, and then we had the regional side that was really trying to keep basic subsistence alive in certain remote parts of the world that didn't have access to any other medium.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And that wasn't just for, for sort of, discretionary travel, for
yep,
some of these remote locations, the
it
regional
was a
aircraft
lifeline.
don't just carry passengers,
Yep,
they carry patients for cancer treatment, for example, in hospitals that don't exist in remote locations. They carry the mail, they carry doctors, they carry staff for educational purposes. So all sorts of, quite important functions that couldn't just shut down.
yep. No, exactly, and they need to work. So here's a second question. I mean, you guys are established lessor. I know that going out to market, as I in the past I've done, where we've done sale leasebacks on ATRs and E-jets and the like, and the issue was that these aircraft are inherently, and I don't say this in a bad way, but are complicated aircraft, and the risk, the metal risk is sometimes maybe underestimated because of the fact that you have a lot of moving parts, no pun intended, on maintenance, on the reserve side. How do you get your arms around not me? I mean, kind of where a lessor is able to account for the fact that maybe you've got a flag carrier that has the flag name on it and then doesn't want to pay reserves or kind of compensate you or protect you, given the complexities of these aircraft types that might need a little bit more, kind of T's and C's on the lease side that account for the risk that is taking on the metal.
Okay, yeah, that's not an irrelevant or indeed uninteresting question. I mean, I guess one of the backgrounds of that is, typically regional aircraft that operate to sort of more remote locations are therefore also perhaps a little bit more susceptible to sort of, unintended things happening, whether that's foreign object damage, um, or getting stuck AOG in a remote location where there's absolutely no support that exists. So yeah, things like that can cause issues. But I think from our point of view, that's one of the reasons why we focus exclusively on regional aircraft. You know, we can't, as a lessor, we cannot just look at this industry purely as a financial services industry would. We really have to understand the metal. We really have to understand the aircraft types that we operate or that our customers operate. And for that reason, we have probably, maybe in comparison to larger lessors, whether that's statistically true or not, it's difficult to say. But we do have a large technical department both internally, and we use out third party providers as well, to make sure that the technical and maintenance aspects of these not uncomplicated aircraft are
Yep.
looked after appropriately.
Yep. Nope. Fair points. Maybe you'll go into some of that on the cost side in the next section. I think you're gonna.
Yeah.
Yep.
So just briefly wanted to talk a little bit about operating costs of regional aircraft, because there's a few unusual features here. It's often believed that the smaller the aircraft the fuel consumption per seat must be higher. Whilst that's often true, it's not always the case. So if you use, for example, a dual class A320neo as a benchmark, it consumes around about 15 kilos of fuel per seat on a relatively short 300 nautical mile sector. Most regional jets consume more than that, as indeed does the Dash 8-400 turboprop. But the ATR 72, as the most fuel efficient turboprop, consumes less on short sectors. Of course, as the sector length increases, the difference does converge due to its slower speed. And of course, the latest change is that the new generation of crossover jets compete favourably with the new generation narrow bodies on fuel burn. And that's why, at TrueNoord, we're very positive about these new small crossover jets or small narrow bodies, depending on what you want to call them. However, of course, Bryson, as you've alluded to, fuel burn is absolutely not everything.
Yep.
So by the time you include crew costs, the cost of a crew, with the exception of the difference between regional airlines operating under the sort of scope clause environment where the crews do get paid a little bit less, crew costs are crew costs. Maintenance costs, ATC landing fees, the Neo does pull back to be marginally better. The chart here, of course, that shows both relative trip costs, which will always favour the small aircraft, and seat costs, per seat costs, which generally favour the larger ones. While non-fuel costs are spread over a small number of seats, then costs inevitably go north. Of course they do. However, the crossover jets remain highly competitive, as does the ATR 72 on a per seat basis. This also means that the lower trip costs of the crossover jets can be put to good use on routes that may only be marginal for larger aircraft.
Yeah. No, and I think,
Mm-hmm.
and so this section coming up is going to be relevant because we've got a lot of questions coming on values. But I was going to say the crossover jet, and I assume you include the A220 in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
I was in one yesterday. Anecdotally, it's such a great aircraft. The cabin's great. The product is great. It's doing what the design mission was intended, and it's good to see this success given the C series launch was wobbly at best.
Indeed.
All right, valuations. You got a lot
Oh,
coming in on
sorry.
this.
Can
So,
I?
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but we've got the leasing bit first,
Oh,
unless you want to
yes.
switch
All
order.
right. I'm jumping ahead. Sorry. Yes. Apologies.
Okay. Okay, I wanted to talk a little about the leasing and perhaps the financing landscape a little bit more broadly before we get to valuations. We've seen this left-hand chart earlier, but it now includes the number of lessors active in each of the segments. As you can see, the lessor space in the regional part is far less crowded. This means that there's less competition, so that whenever there's an RFP from an airline to lease aircraft in the turboprop segment, there's really more than a handful of bids. The crossover segment can be more competitive for well-known names, as obviously some of the mainstream lessors also compete in this space. It also means that lease rate factors tend to be higher. For example, you will never see a lease rate factor in the regional world beginning with 0.6. But as the regional lessors do not have the same scale as the larger lessors, their cost of funding is often also, in fairness, a bit higher. So unlike the narrow body world, where for some aircraft, over 50% of the world's aircraft are leased, that's not the case in the regional aircraft space. Depending on which aircraft type, the proportion of leased aircraft can vary between less than 10% to over 70%. At the low penetration end of the spectrum, the 70-seat jet segment, as we've already seen, is dominated by North American carriers. In that market, carriers tend to prefer other forms of financing their aircraft, so that leasing is rather less prevalent compared to the rest of the world. By contrast, the ATR 72 and the E190 fleet, which is more geographically diverse, the proportion of leased aircraft is similar to that of the larger aircraft. Now, just interestingly, you will see that E195E2 looks like a bit of an outlier here. This is largely because a few of the early large anchor customers like Azul, Porter, and even KLM Cityhopper lease the majority of their aircraft. Now, just to complete this here, the right-hand scale shows the number of lessors for each aircraft type. And as such, you can see that for no aircraft type is there more than 19 lessors. And for some, there's only one or two. So reverting to scale of regional lessors point, just wanted to show you a little bit about sort of, who's who in this world. This is reflected by the fact that there are only 5 regional aircraft lessors with over 100 aircraft, apart from DAE and AerCap. Its regional jet exposure is all inherited from NAC. Prior to that acquisition by NAC, DAE was, of course, also already a large lessor in the ATR 72 space. In the case of AerCap, most of these aircraft were a legacy of its takeover of GCAS. The former GCAS portfolio predominantly comprises older midlife aircraft, apart from its E2 commitment, which is Azul and regionals aren't really core business for AerCap today.
Do you think? Oh, go ahead. Sorry,
Oh, go
you
on.
can answer my question. Yep.
Yeah.
No, fair enough. Go ahead.
I was simply going to finish this bit off here.
Yeah.
So when you divide the lessors into the turboprop and regional jet landscape, you see that AerCap drops out of the top 6 for TPs and DA drops out of it for regional crossover jets. Azora, for example, which is predominantly a regional aircraft lessor, is solely active in the regional jet space, while Falco and ourselves have a balance of both, leaving, I guess, both of us in 2nd and 4th positions, respectively. So, yeah, to your question.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I mean, anybody who looked at this space would kind of say that, I mean, we all saw there was a point where the larger lessors kind of dipped their toe in, and, especially on the ATR side, and then kind of said, and then sold their portfolios to, I think, NAC in some cases. And now DAE has them, and you have AerCap having a little bit. I mean, where you guys are pretty competitive. What, I mean, kind of top 3 points of takeaway of where lessors like yourselves really add value vis-a-vis, no pun intended, vis-a-vis perhaps larger lessors that are more focused on mainline wide body, and the regional fleet is by nature just not as comprehensive.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing to say there, Bryson, is that a lot of the major leasing companies around got into the regional space in a smallish way because of the competition in the narrow body space, in the sense that some of those lessors were able to win narrow body mandates by also agreeing to take a certain number of regional aircraft at the time, um, which is all fine and well, but the big lessors aren't really fully set up to manage regional aircraft. And as I've mentioned before, the task of, and as you've alluded to before, the task of managing regional aircraft portfolios from a technical point of view is a very different exercise to managing the larger aircraft types. So for those lessors that have both, you kind of almost have to double up on your internal infrastructure to manage those fleets. So it's not always efficient for the big lessors to manage those regional aircraft fleets. And over the years, in the case of TrueNoord, we've acquired many sub fleets of aircraft from big leasing companies and other leasing companies who didn't consider those to be core assets, whereas they are for us.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because there's a question about M&A activity in this space, and what we saw with NAC is we had a big chunk of E-jets, people wanting the narrow body order book, and then you had some turboprops in there, and it was a kind of eclectic kind of everything. But any thoughts on the M&A possibilities in the regional lessor space? I was involved in a selling of a regional lessor last year, but it really wasn't M&A. It was, but it could have been. There were some bids in there that could have made it an M&A activity, but it was ultimately taken by a PE client, or PE op buyer. But thoughts on M&A space, given kind of the proclivities and characteristics of this market?
Uh, you know, M&A is always possible in this market, but given that the market is quite small and there isn't very many players in it, the opportunities for M&A are much smaller than they are in the larger leasing market, simply because there's far less players. And I think we've sort of the regional space is gradually coalescing around half a dozen or so players in that space, and some of them operate to really quite different business models in the sense that TrueNoord, for example, our business model is very much to acquire aircraft on an on balance sheet basis rather than managed funds, which is the business model of some of our competitors. So from an M&A perspective, it wouldn't be easy to marry those different types of business models.
Yep. No, and I think it's interesting that you say that because I think somebody brought up the collapse of NAC and kind of where that business model came about, given its evolution. Um, uh, what lessons were learned from the NAC collapse, if you will? I mean, is there any thoughts? I mean, was NAC ever a target of you guys or anybody in your kind of ether? Um, any thoughts on that?
Um, well, I think NAC was in the position a number of years ago of practically having a monopoly in this space because it was the only lessor of scale. But you could also argue that NAC grew phenomenally quickly over the years. At one point it had I think over 500 aircraft. So I think there is something to be said for saying that well, maybe it just grew too quickly and it couldn't digest everything.
Yeah. No, and yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a lot of things we could say offline about this too. So I
Sure.
won't put you in. I won't
Yeah, yeah.
let you go in there. But yeah, no, I think that is definitely a noted point. So all right, so we have valuations. So I think let's get into this one because I think there's a lot of chatter around this one right now.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess to start with, it wouldn't be ISTAT if we didn't talk about value somewhere along the way. Um, but I think there's a few important things to say here. And in the sense that it's quite a common misconception that regional aircraft don't hold their residual values over the long term, as well as narrow body aircraft or indeed other wide body aircraft. In fact, there is some evidence to suggest that they do so just as well, if not better than larger aircraft. So, for example, what you're seeing in this slide here is data based on the opinion of collateral verifications, which in the case of the 70-seaters would show that the opposite is true, that over a 20-year period to 2025, 70-seat RJs actually performed slightly better than narrow bodies. However, you have to say, that's the view of one appraiser, and not all have the same view. So that in fairness, it might be reasonable to conclude that they perform similarly. Looking at this another way, with an example from Cirium, looking at future values instead of historical ones, you might think that there's an inconsistency with the previous slide, in that Cirium are suggesting that the 70-seaters would perform less well going forward than the larger aircraft, but that wouldn't be right either. The previous chart showed 70-seaters from when they were new, but this is now a mature market with only the E175, as we've talked about, still in production. We've already seen that the average age of the 70-seaters is increasing, so that the obsolescence of that fleet is likely to be closer for this category of regional aircraft than for others, let alone the newest generation of narrow bodies. So perhaps over a long-term horizon, the 70-seaters might not do as well. But the point here is, I think that you can't just use the 70-seaters as a proxy for all regional aircraft. As such, we see a couple of other examples here, which suggests that the ATR 72 will perform similarly to an A320 sized aircraft, and that in their view, the A220 Bryson that you talked about a few minutes ago would perform even better. So anyway, there's a variety of different views here. Looking at turboprops in a little bit more detail, here's just an example of how current market values, according to various appraisers, have evolved over time. And this is us doing a chart here, averaging out the views of the various appraisers listed. In this case, the ATR 72-600 values were already falling a little bit before COVID, but didn't see the massive drop-off that many others experienced during the pandemic. As many ATRs, as we've already said, either continued to operate on essential services during the pandemic, or were first out of the blocks when travel restrictions began to ease. Since then, as with many other aircraft types, supply chain issues, of course, is the big theme of today, and that's had the effect of keeping values of used aircraft that are airworthy in really quite a strong place. But you can say that of most aircraft types. The story for the E190 fleet is not that dissimilar, in that although the pandemic led to value declines, some continued to operate throughout. For example, here in Europe, KLM Cityhopper services on its E190 fleet were back to full strength long before any of the other types in its fleet. The shortage of capacity meant that values have recovered in recent years. This appears particularly to be true for the midlife aircraft. But as almost none of the newer aircraft of recent vintages have been traded, there's really very few data points to support the thesis either way. So it means that what's shown here is perhaps a little bit theoretical. So I think that's about all I've got really on values. I'm sure there'll be loads of questions on that.
Yeah. I'll let you do your takeaway points, and then we can, because I know we are. How are you doing on time, my friend? Are we okay for a couple more minutes? I know we were supposed to stop in a minute, but you have a couple more minutes to ask questions and to answer some questions.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Why don't you do the next slide, and then we'll come back to some of the valuation stuff. And yeah.
Okay. I just thought I'd leave you guys with a few key takeaways from the slides you've seen so far. I guess the first one is that, it's important to realize that regional aircraft are an integral part of the aviation ecosystem. Secondly, performance assumes an outsized level of importance in the regional aviation space. Most regional aircraft simply provide capacity to others, which in some ways is a good insulator against downturns. Operating costs are not always higher than for larger aircraft. The leasing landscape is smaller and less competitive. As I mentioned already, regional aircraft can be a great tool in a downturn. Regional aircraft seem to maintain their values remarkably well. And just to kind of sort of finish off on new technology, this will impact the regional space long before the larger aircraft world, simply because all of the projects and the technology possible only allows smaller capacity regional aircraft in this space, which I guess was why, from a sustainability perspective, for the larger aircraft, at least for now, SAF is really the only game in town.
Yep. No, no, you're absolutely right. And I think, kind of given the largesse of the requirement to look at the larger aircraft on the sustainable side, SAF is the natural practical stepping stone. We always forget, or people not in aviation forget, that safety is paramount, and we need to make sure aircraft can fly and transport people to A to B. And the regional market is a little more applicable to that, as far as, not that it's less safe, because it's equally as safe, but that the technologies are more positioned better for um, evolution of technology to on range and mission profile, given some of the newer technologies of.
Yeah, I mean, this is simply
Yeah,
as you've got to start somewhere, and you've got to
we gotta
start
start
small.
somewhere. Can't start with a
Yep.
777.
Yep.
So let's go back to valuations. As you know, it's near and dear to my heart as well. Um, and I'm a big fan of ATR 72. I think it's a perfect business case study. I think it's the perfect half-life aircraft. If you look at it, you actually prove my point as far as kind of the value evolution. We saw a massive upswing in ATR values, and that also, I would say, probably had to do with the fact that ATR 72 has no competition. So it's now almost in the field of being a monopoly, if you will, given the fact that Dash 8, until it does come back, if it does, the ATR is the only game in town. So why don't we go back? There's a couple slides. I think you had on the E190. There's a lot of questions around the E190. And then I think there's also a question on the E175. But kind of thoughts on the E190. I mean, let's dig into this a little bit if you got more time.
Mhm.
Is the E190 becoming, one question is the E190 becoming less popular, losing value? Do we see a market collapse in the E190? Any thoughts on this?
Um, People have been talking about the potential collapse of the E190 market for many years, because as with any aircraft type, um, when it first comes into service, the fleet does tend to be concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of big operators. Um, so, at least in theory, there is a risk there of, what do you do with these fleets when, one or two of those big airlines decide they want to replace them and go with something else? Um, but, to the experience that we've seen to date is that actually the E190 has been quite successful at finding a secondary user base. um, from big names like Copa, Air Canada, who were big operators of early fleets. Most of those have been reabsorbed, and in some cases in large numbers in places like Alliance in Australia. As I've already mentioned, some of the existing operators are committing long term to the E190 fleet. So yes, of course, there can always be a black swan event, but like with any aircraft type, but we're not at all negative on the sort of secondary operator base of the E190. You know, our remarketing team internally within TrueNoord is finding homes for and quite good homes with decent counterparty risks for E190s that are coming back to us.
Is the P2F um, kind of part of your paradigm? Is it as a residual modeling, and do you think it's a viable opportunity?
Well, I think we see very, very limited opportunities for the P2F. It does sort of sit slightly oddly between the 737 size aircraft and the ATR 72 freighter market capacity. Um, and we've asked ourselves questions several times as to whether that's something we should get involved in. We're certainly not saying no, um, but we do need to see a bit of an operator base in order to do that.
Yep. No, and I think the P2F has been a nice residual punt, if you will, for some of the other aircraft, and then ironically, those that were really relying on cheap feedstock for the P2F have now seen the fact that the PAX is more demand than the freighter, and I mean it'll pivot again, as you and I both well know. But it's ironic. It always feels like whenever there's a P2F program to help preserve residual value comes into play, all of a sudden the PAX side becomes a little more in demand.
Well,
Um,
exactly, and
yeah,
that sort of thing could easily change the dynamics. If you were to be negative and one of the remaining large E1 operators decided it was going to dump a large amount of aircraft on the market, and there wasn't an obvious home, the P2F, might be a solution at that point.
yeah, no,
If there is then a
exactly.
shortage of other aircraft that you might use instead.
Well, and it helps with the analysis, right? Because we know that there's some aircraft that just don't have a future life, and this helps. So let's kind of keep this on the E-Jet side. A question came in about the E175, and it said, would the value of the E175 be higher if it had more world presence, more so than the US? Uh, would the limited customers not be the reasons for the lower value, whereas the ATR has a lot more customers? So customer base, right? I mean, we look at this in the analysis evaluation and the future. You just said it yourself. Concentrated risk in one customer defines a program. What are your thoughts on the E175?
Well, I guess because the E175 is so concentrated amongst the US customers, if ever there came a time um, that market changed, for example, scope clauses changed, or there was something else that came along that it could be deemed to replace it. Um, the future residual value of that aircraft type might not look great because the customer base elsewhere around the world is limited. It would absorb some, but it might struggle to absorb the kind of volume that might come out of the US if that were to happen. But we
Yeah.
don't, as I say, we don't see that happening anytime soon.
No, I mean, and we know the reasons why, pretty much. So another question came in, which I thought was interesting, is that would it be true to say that engine issues on the newer tech options are delaying some people from replacing their E190s? Are you seeing that? Are you getting feedback from your marketing guys as far as kind of, hey, we want to, when they go talk to clients, like the E190 is a known technology, the CF34 is a known engine. We want to keep it as long as we can. Is that part of that conversation?
If you're comparing it to new technology in the sense of the current E2s and A220s, the answer is yes. There is an element of that. Um, there are definitely some customers who are taking the attitude, maybe we should see the engine program for the GTF mature a little bit more.
Hmm.
That has certainly been feedback, over the years, but I think that's starting to dissipate now, and particularly with the fact that a number of airlines are now starting to, you know, order next generation E2s and A220s. they are also at the same time starting to get worried about, oh my God, if we do order these things, we're going to have to wait years to get them,
Yep.
in the same way as the narrow bodies.
So in kind of parting that, and I think it's it, and that is exactly the case, right? I mean, I think there's, hey, we know it's same, especially the wide bodies. You know, like the wide body, we have these aircraft, they're running fine. We know the engines, we know the technologies. It's a big risk to kind of wait for something that doesn't exist yet or is having a hard time delivering. Um, as far as market segmentation goes, it's interesting because I think we're hitting to where maybe you disagree or agree, but the 717, right? Like what was that line in the sand where the 717, the success of and the lack of the success of the 717, we're kind of in that range. I mean, is your mind is the regional market a sub 100 aircraft, or is it are we the gray area of the regional market now expanding to kind of now, as you say, the crossover of A220, E195, E2, larger types that almost are 717 like. Yet the 717 failed. Yet the E2, especially A220 is doing well. What thoughts on that line in the sand, and also thoughts on the market kind of being where it is?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure actually, in the end of the day, how helpful it is to try and draw that line in the sand. An airline needs a certain type of aircraft for a particular mission. So why artificially draw this line in the sand between regional and narrow body? What purpose does it really serve? In the end of the day, the airlines need what they need.
Well, and that's it. And I think that also is define the leasing space, right?
Yeah,
So I mean,
I mean, the
it
fact
just
is that
all of a sudden
that's
it's like,
that.
oh, you're a
Yeah,
regional
yeah,
lessor. Well, we are playing the market, and as you said, the benefit of some of these guys can be able to say, hey, we could do A220s and ATRs, not just one. And the specialization of that, knowing the metal, is key.
yeah.
Um, I'll close out next couple minutes. I know we're kind of probably hitting a bit of time, but there was one question that came in, and that was somebody was asking about: is there a real difference between in lease terms between regional and single aisle aircraft? So, what would you say the difference is? Is there a difference in lease terms between mainline and region, and again the regional marker?
Sorry, I didn't
Is
quite
it
get that.
lease terms? As far as tenor.
Oh, as far as tenor is
Yeah.
concerned,
Yeah.
is there a difference? Um, uh, Not substantially. Yes, if you're in the US or North America, and you lease regional aircraft, although not that many do, then the term of the lease does tend to be very, very long. 10 years plus. But outside that, elsewhere in Europe or elsewhere around the world, um, you know, the tenor of a lease, is fairly similar, possibly a little bit longer in some cases.
Yep.
But on average, I wouldn't say there's a big difference.
Well, in North America, it was always those leverage leases too, which were like
Yeah, yeah,
12-year
yeah.
leases that kind of the tenor was longer. Um, what are your thoughts on Comac? Where they come in as far as competition in this space? Is Comac? Would you guys ever do a sale lease back or order Comac aircraft? What's the thought?
Gosh, I mean, we can't discount it. Um, Absolutely not. And we have had some initial discussions, but it's certainly not on the immediate horizon. But we wouldn't say no. Depending on where these aircraft go, it could become a target in future.
Yeah. No. Again, it goes back to kind of looking where Sukhoi kind of got in, then got out. They couldn't service.
Well, this
Um,
is this is the thing. You see,
yeah.
there's all these concerns that have been mentioned multiple times about after sales support and all those good things.
Yep. No, agreed. I know there's some questions out here still. They're a little bit relating to other kind of sections. I think we've covered most of them. Apologies in advance to people who asked questions that I haven't gotten to, but I pulled the ones that I thought were germane to the discussion and that were helpful. And Angus, your insights and knowledge in this is greatly appreciated. This has been a fantastic webinar. People have really enjoyed. I've gotten comments just saying thank you and fantastic information. They're looking forward to seeing your slides. So we'll do a follow-up on this at some point because I do believe the sector is emerging. And I think people definitely, given the metal, people are taking a look at this, and the opportunities are there. So again, thank you for your time, my friend, and it's great to see you.
Well, thank you very much, Bryson. It's a pleasure. And if you would like any of those sort of residual questions answered, fire them over, and I'll scribble a line or two on each.
Yeah, we'll see what we can do. We just get a name. We don't get much of the contact details. But they're also just kind of comments about stuff you made. So it's again, I tried to address them all. They're great questions, insights, and again, thank you very much, my friend.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. This will be available on the ISTAT website. Same with the information provided by Angus on this deck. Always visit the ISTAT website for more stuff, and we'll have more content coming throughout the rest of the year. And thank you again, all. Take care.
Thank you.